networks. One of the things that I have observed over the years, and I don't know if it's correct or not. I want to throw out just to discuss a little bit regarding economics, is that the sustainable networks on the internet are networks that don't try to maximize their economics, and that they actually try to minimize their economics, and that sustainable networks potentially are at odds with the entire notion of capitalism, which is about maximizing economics. And so, you know, I'm curious if other people have observed that, and whether that's a crock of whatever, or actually, you know, something to think about.
So Craig's an example.
Excuse me?
Craig is the, yes.
Craig's an example of a network that didn't try to maximize itself, but minimized itself.
But has some economics in it, right? That's the interesting thing about it, because we were talking about Wikipedia before, and I think Clay said that Wikipedia has struggled to sustain itself, and that its economics are so thin that it may not be sustainable, whereas I think Craigslist, at least, I mean, I'm not familiar with the economics, but it appears to be sustainable economically, but not maximized economically.
I take issue with your use of the term capitalism. The term is so broad, it means all sorts of things, because especially these days with people who pretend to be defending capitalism, who are actually just trying to restrict it, to create restrictions so that they're a functioning elite. And those are the issues that that concern me. You know, so we're very much part of that capitalist system. We just made some different decisions based on values. My disclaimer being that I'm what I'm calling a libertarian pragmatist. I hope that's as confusing as possible.
I think it's a little unfair to then say that Craigslist didn't really maximize, because you look at the success, and especially, I mean, you look at the success of Craigslist as a function of how many employees they have, and you say, like, well, they've clearly, you know, so and the sort of the length of success that they've had, where you look at companies that then, you know, seek to perhaps maximize in the traditional way, what you see is this sort of trajectory of, like, they'll shoot up, but then they'll disappear.
But by maximize, you mean capture all of the value, and that's what Craig didn't do. Craig created value, but he couldn't.
You are all aware that Craigslist makes more money per employee than Google does, right?
Yeah, but
which is a part of the point. I think that there's a time element in there as well, which often gets ignored, where people talk about, you know, trying to, you know, maximize revenue, and they look at it in a snapshot way and not over time. And what I think Craigslist has done very well, whether on purpose or by accident, I don't know, Craig can explain, is, you know, really effectively maximize over time and be able to continue this.
Really? That's what you're doing? That's what you're doing? Because it doesn't sound like that's what you're doing. It doesn't seem like your objective at all, to be maximizing revenue over time.
I don't know if it, as I said, I don't know if it's his objective or not, and I'll let him speak, but I think that's what happens.
Larry's really on the same thing here, but it's Tim O'Reilly. I think this notion that networks are value creation, and there's sort of a cycle where networks that create more value than they capture grow, and once they start capturing more value than they create, they start to stabilize and shrink. And, you know, that's certainly been something I've thought a lot about in the history of technology. Microsoft, you know, rode this incredible wave of you know, the democratization of computing. Was this value-creating network in the open architecture of the PC. Microsoft rode that, and as they sort of became dominant, they closed it down, started taking more value out of the system than they created, and innovation moved elsewhere. And sort of,
and this is, I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? Is how much value is the network creating versus how much value is the network capturing for itself. If that could be measured, that could be a very interesting arbiter of whether or not one would want to own that network.
Well, there are a couple different things at issue here that I think are very relevant to the policy context that we'll talk about later, which is, this is Albert Wenger, which is that these networks create value for the participants in the network. Some of it is economic value, we've talked about that. Some of it is emotional value. And that a lot of traditional policy making, however, doesn't look at all of that. It looks at corporations and the value captured by corporations and profits as sort of the primary measure of the success or lack of success of policy. And so I don't think there's a fundamental incompatibility with capitalism, but there's a fundamental incompatibility with how we're governing and how we're measuring the things that we should be governing.
By the way, there's an interesting comment on Twitter from a guy named Dave Witzel. He says, you shouldn't use economics to equal private profit maximization. It's the study of allocation of scarce resources. And there's sort of an interesting question here of sort of the private versus public value creation axis as one of the, and one of the things that Craig thinks about is, wow, he's created all this value for the network and for the participants in the network and captured some of it for Craigslist and its employees. And there's certainly other systems where people capture way more for themselves, while either even destroying, as we saw in the financial crisis. But certainly in other cases, not. Where's the slider on public versus private capture versus creation?
Well, I don't refer to the slider, but there's definitely a difference between maximizing revenues and maximizing value. And that's the important difference.
Yeah, and Fred, you talk about how can you measure that so investors can know, but it's also really important for users to know, because users are the ones that drive the viability and the importance and the success of these networks. And back to Tim's point earlier about how can we ensure that our future institutions that we're building on top of these networks are the kind that we want. Part of it is we want to be able to quantify and socialize that balance of how much am I capturing versus how much am I giving, and use that as some kind of metric for ensuring good competition among the new networks that we create and giving people a choice to move around and incentivizing good behavior among the providers.
One of the things that I think that we see in these sort of networked peer organizations is really low barriers to entry and exit, so that people can just show by coming and going which values they care about and which institutions they want to preserve and which ones they want to discard.
It seems to me that the economics of networks are almost, or let me put it this way, are very often not realized by the people who create the networks. And they're created by people who solve a problem that the network has unearthed. So you think about Tim Berners-Lee creates the web, we all collectively create the web, one of the great, probably far more than open source software, the collective web is the greatest peer production system we've built. And you look at who has monetized it. People who found problems that the web did not solve or that it created, like search. They found ways to actually deal with something that the network didn't do. And so I think it may be worthwhile as we think about networks and the future of networks to ask ourselves what they fail at, because that will tell us something about what organization is going to develop on top of them.
And that's actually one thing we've been talking about, and this is Nick Grossman, in trying to unpack the difference between networks that make you feel say and ones that make you feel say And to some extent, I think it's where the value is captured and who's realizing that value. And we think about the difference between Etsy and the iPhone platform, say, or Amazon. And I don't know that there's a clear answer on this, but there's something about the values that are baked into that network, but then also where the economics of that network are realized.
There's also an issue of the governance of that network. If you feel empowered by the network, then you tend to support it and encourage it and invest in it and contribute to it. If you feel controlled by it, you tend not to. And I think that's also related to where the economics is captured. And I think this is an evolving thing.
Let me say something quickly, and then I'll shut up. For a while. Years ago, I was addressing a bunch of bank CEOs, major bankers, several members of the Federal Reserve Board, and I asked them if they had a minute to decide whether they would give up all of their assets, public and private, or corporate and personal, and all of their relationships, which would they choose? And nobody went with their assets, because everybody understood that they could rebuild their assets from their relationships, but not the other way around. And I said, well, why do you go on placing so much emphasis in economic theory on the thing that is less important to you? And one of them said, because we can measure it. And now I think we're actually reaching a point where we can start to measure relationships in some quantitative way.
But one of the things that it says, and I think this sense of these networks is, there are economic ramifications from these networks, but they're not primarily modeled economically. They are mainly modeled on social relations between the participants. I mean, Wikipedia's famous fights to even have an economic model adequate to its hosting needs shows you how far afield you can get from just a purely economic structuring of these. So in a lot of these networks, it's the implementation layer for behavioral economics in a way, which is to say there are domains of cash transaction and there are domains of human association. And there are ways to combine those things so the cash transactions destroy the human associations. And there are ways to combine those things so the cash transactions support the human associations, right? Flickr hitting on Flickr Pro is a way of saying everybody wants everybody's photos to be free and a small group of people are willing to come forward. That's not an economic model you would have thought of until you had this notion that there are social relations to be hosted, but not to be taken advantage of in a completely extractive way. And I think that one of the great sources of tension between the incumbent industries and these networks is the non-commoditizable nature of human relations inside these networks. And I've never seen it better described than in this SIC code passage in Wealth of Networks, but I think that that's a big part of the political and economic fight that we face is asserting a set of models that respect social relations outside the completely commodified sphere.
Absolutely. I think one of the ways in which the incumbents are threatened is that they are now competing in a way that they are really have one hand tied behind their back. I mean, if somebody is pursuing a passion project on Kickstarter or creating things that they love to do on Etsy, they're working for a set of economics that are entirely different than the industrial process, and the industrial process has a very hard time competing with that set of economics.